Okay, I've lost my video. There it is. I'm back. Yeah, so let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the third Thursday of the month Housing Institute presentation. Before we introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind you all about the virtual learning environment for this round of the Housing Institute. It's hosted on Moodle. I'm going to share my screen so folks can kind of have a little bit of a tour as I go through this. Excuse me. So to log in, you will go to the site, the URL mhp-housing-institute.moodle.school. Enter your username, which is your first name dot last name, all lowercase, and your password, and you will be able to access the course. You scroll down a little bit, you'll see the link to the Southern Minnesota Housing Institute 2020, and click on that, and it will take you to the to our site that houses all the information and materials that have been presented and will be presented on during the Housing Institute presentations. And it's divided into the 5 different modules that we'll be following: groundwork, communication, collaboration, development, and financial resources. If you scroll down a little bit further, you will see in each one of the modules, there is additional materials specific to the focus of the module. And we've got a lot of really good information in the Module 3 resources that has just recently been uploaded. Primarily information on community development resources, tax increment financing, housing and redevelopment, collaboration, and collective impact. If you look over to the table of contents at the top right left-hand corner, you'll see the 4 different areas of information in the resources folder. So you can click on any one of these and it will take you to a page that contains different links and different reports and different information on that topic. In addition, so there's lots of really good reading in here and some late night reading. For those of you who can't fall asleep, this has been proven to assist with that problem.
Great.
And in addition, if folks are interested, we'll be hanging around after the presentation and we can do a walkthrough with those folks who want more information or would like to be able to go through the Moodle platform in a little bit more detail. So stick around if you'd like some additional assistance or you'd like to explore the Moodle platform. Before you go today, we'd like you to fill out the online survey, and Harlan's going to put the link in the chat box for your convenience. If you have to leave before you complete the survey, the link can be found under today's presentation information on Moodle or in Module 3 on Moodle. So to find that, you just go back up into Housing Institute 7, scroll down to Module 3, scroll down to today's information, and you'll find it right here. All you have to do is click on the link and it'll open up into a SurveyMonkey survey. So please fill that out either today or in the next week or so. That really does help us prepare for future presentations and gives us the feedback we need to really turn this into something useful and special. Also, one other housekeeping item, please mute your mic, say that 5 times fast, unless speaking. This will help avoid unwanted feedback. And we're asking participants to hold off on their questions until the end of the presentation or you can enter them into the chat feature, and Harlan will field those questions after the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce Shannon Sweeney. We have a very experienced presenter today. He's going to explain some available financing tools available through local governments. Throughout the Housing Institutes, we are always impressing upon the importance of collaboration. And this is just one example of how private development can partner with public entities to make housing development happen in communities. Shannon currently works as an associate at David Drown Associates, where he serves his clients in the area of economic development, including tax increment financing, tax abatement, grant writing, financial packaging, and organizational development. Shannon has a master's degree in urban planning and has experience working in administrative roles for rural city governments. His work as a fiscal advisor to Minnesota communities for the consulting firm of David Drown includes a broad range of projects such as public improvements, public hospitals and nursing homes, electric revenue projects, and public housing. Shannon's going to walk us through the basics of tax increment financing, tax abatement, and essential function bonds, all of which can be used to subsidize expenses associated with the development of affordable housing that otherwise would not be feasible. According to the Minnesota Office of the State Auditor, in 2019, $243 million of tax increment revenue was generated statewide, with over 11 million generated in greater Minnesota for housing alone. In 2019 alone, 91 new TIF districts were certified, of which 35% were housing districts, accounting for the largest portion of all new districts. When you start talking these kinds of numbers, it's easy to see how tax increment financing can be a useful tool in Minnesota. With that, MHP is pleased to introduce Shannon Sweeney, and I will turn it over to you now, Shannon.
Thanks, Barbara. It's funny you should mention a pillow, because every time I start my presentation on tax increment financing and tax abatement, I indicate that folks should bring a pillow, and hopefully they ate a large lunch, because it's probably going to put them to sleep fairly quickly. But we try to make it a little bit interesting. And as I'm from Fairmont, I better indicate that Vonnie Cohn, you'll be tested on this presentation at some point in the future when I run into you in Fairmont. So just so you understand that. I'm going to share my screen and we'll dive into this presentation. All right. All right, so we're going to start this presentation in talking about tax increment financing. You hear the words a lot. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding as to how it's applied or what it is and what it all means. And so we'll try to break it down to its essence before we get into the weeds a little bit on how this all works. Ultimately, it's a financing tool that captures and redirects new property taxes paid by new private development. And there's a but-for test associated with TIF that's mandated in statute that says without the TIF assistance, the project wouldn't be able to proceed. And so oftentimes we get caught up a little bit in the process of determining if a project meets a but-for test and ultimately requires the use of TIF. But at the end of the day, that's a standard that must be applied. So tax increment is a financing program. It uses new property taxes. And again, it's only meant to move new projects forward when assistance is absolutely required. And just to give you a sample of what all this means, if we have an existing vacant parcel that presently has an assessor's estimated market value, so the county says that it's worth $50,000 for tax purposes, and it currently pays $1,000 in property taxes. Let's say we place that parcel in a TIF district, and an apartment is developed on it, and the county says that that apartment is now worth $525,000 in market value, and the new taxes are $11,000. Well, the increase of $10,000 in local property tax is the tax increment. It's not the original base $1,000 that's paid by the property. It's only those new taxes. And to further illustrate that, we give you this example. Where do the taxes go? Before the project, that $1,000 is split between the city, county, and school district. You know, these are approximations, but you know, they apply in most Minnesota communities as to the dollar value of the property tax share. And then the tax increments as captured are above and beyond that $1,000 that continues to go to the city, county, and school district. So when you create a TIF district, you know, folks often might say, well, you're stealing property taxes from us. Well, we're not really doing that. What we're doing is we're foregoing the benefit of the new property tax for a specified period of time. So they still receive that tax off of that base market value. So nobody's tax base is reduced through the creation of a TIF district. And when the TIF district expires, the property value is added to the tax rolls, and everybody gets a much larger split from ultimately the taxes that are being paid from the property. And so that's the ultimate benefit that folks see in participating and using tax increment financing. One, it's moving a good project forward that wouldn't otherwise occur. And two, at the end of the duration of the subsidy, we're receiving more property taxes than we used to. And plus, we're also providing some much needed housing as our topic today. So key observations we make is, again, that the project wouldn't otherwise move forward, that all taxing jurisdictions continue to receive the same property tax that they initially received before the district was created, and that the developer is ultimately paying normal taxes just like everyone else. A tax increment district just redirects those property taxes for a specified period of time, and that's capped through the legislative process. But so what can we do if we create this TIF district and we're capturing that $10,000 in new property tax off of our apartment example? Well, one, those expenditures have to be authorized in the plan that's adopted when the TIF district's created. But the things that we can spend them on are land acquisition. These are subsidies directly to a private developer. Grading and excavating, parking, driveways, utility extensions, site improvements, other items. Generally, I've never had an issue with finding sufficient eligible costs to reimburse with tax increments. A significant portion of the project costs are ultimately eligible to be reimbursed. From a city, county, township perspective, we can fund public streets, sewer and water extensions, parking, sidewalks and alleys, those kinds of improvements that serve a new project. So sometimes we'll see an entity create a tax increment financing district to reimburse itself for costs incurred in extending streets and utilities to a new project area. So what's this process involve to create a TIF district? It includes a written plan that I alluded to earlier. It establishes geographic boundaries. It names parcels that we're intending to include, and it can include more than one parcel or project area. It has goals and objectives that are described. It has a budget, says this is how much we intend to collect, and this is how much we're authorizing ourselves to spend within this TIF district. And then it covers some other, what I'll call governmental details associated with pooling or using increments between districts, any penalties for local government aid, which have ceased to exist, or other details. So if I'm a municipality and I want to create a district, here's an important point for you to understand. When I initiate this process to create a tax increment district, I'm sending a 30-day notice to the county and school district indicating our intention to create the TIF district. I'm providing them with a copy of the tax increment plan. I'm publishing notice in the newspaper to invite the public in to comment on the creation of this TIF district. I'm holding a public hearing in order to receive all of that comment, and ultimately I'm certifying this district to the county and the state. In that process, you never heard me say, am I asking the school district or county for permission? That's not required in statute. And this will be a fundamental difference that we'll talk about between tax increment financing and tax abatement. When a city, county create a TIF district, they are informing the other units of government of what they're up to, but they're not asking for permission, as that's not required in statute. I would say that ultimately that lack of permission that's required by statute has led to many amendments to our state statutes that govern TIF to make it more restrictive, a little more difficult to use, better define how it's used, but ultimately when you compare statutes associated with tax increment financing versus tax abatement, there's really no comparison because TIF law has gotten far more complicated in its history. And I believe it's mostly because we're not seeking permission of other units of government when we create that district. So if we create this tax increment district for owner-occupied housing, what strings are attached? For owner-occupied housing, we have to meet income restrictions. As we do in rental housing as well. But for owner-occupied housing, 95% of the assisted units must be initially purchased and occupied. Actually, it's first occupied by families at or below 100% of statewide median income for 2 people and 115% of statewide median income for 3 or more. So you say we're going to use a TIF subsidy for single family residential housing. We must be doing something that, isn't serving working class folks that we care to serve in using a property tax subsidy. Well, those income restrictions last year and into the early part of this year were $91,800 for a 2-person family or fewer. So that's the maximum income that they could have and be in an owner-occupied housing TIF district, and $105,570 for 3 or more. So these are fairly generous income limits that apply, and they only apply to the first occupant. We don't have to track these income restrictions for the life of a TIF district like we do with rental housing, just the first occupant. But understand that 95% of the units have to qualify. So if we build a housing subdivision and we use tax increment financing in the following manner, let's say we use it to reduce the lot cost by $15,000. This equates to about a 10 to 15 year TIF subsidy, for a single family residential home. And, here's I'll walk through how this plays out. A new home is valued at $175,000 by the county. It generates approximately $2,300 a year in new property tax that we can capture. So it's called tax increment. That $2,300 per year for a period of 10 years is sufficient to reimburse principal and interest on $15,000 or more in special assessments. So a lot that costs $50,000 to develop, which is a common number these days for the cost of developing single family residential lots, could be sold for $35,000 to a qualified buyer. And so this is for the vast majority of my communities that have decided to use tax increment financing to support single family residential development, this is ultimately the model that they've used, whether it be to assist a private developer or a publicly owned subdivision. And so they're using that future revenue off of houses that are built within that subdivision to pay off a portion of the cost of installing the infrastructure. And that subsidy ultimately is in that $15,000 to $20,000 range these days based on valuations that we're seeing on houses. And that's what we have the ability to buy down the lot cost. So what happens if we have somebody interested in buying a lot that doesn't meet the income requirement? they're above our income restriction that's applied by state statute. Vast majority of instances, that parcel is simply removed from the TIF district, and those folks are required to pay fair market price for that lot. We're not able to apply those tax increments for the benefit of those folks that don't qualify by income. And it hasn't been a significant issue in most of the projects that we worked on. Vast majority of folks have qualified because it's a pretty generous income restriction. And those that don't, have sufficient resources to pay the additional cost of the lot. And it's mandated by state statute. So not much we can do about that. So just some examples of some more modest single family homes I've taken pictures of over the years that have received tax increment subsidies. These were back when we started, in earnest on some of these projects about 20 years ago. I questioned whether somebody would want to buy a house like this for, at the time, $135,000 versus buying an existing home in the community for $75,000. And overwhelmingly, in some of the communities we work in, we found that they wanted houses like this. They wanted new construction. It was important to them. It created a market and an unmet demand. And the use of tax increment financing helped make these things a little bit more affordable than they would have been otherwise. And it doesn't always have to be single family detached homes. There are attached homes that qualify, as an owner occupied unit. They can certainly be assisted with tax increment financing. We've done patio homes, which have generally been more of a senior housing product based on, a slab on grade construction, but ultimately it still qualifies. And so, think outside the box a little bit on some of the products that can be assisted and still meet those market niches where you have demand. So for rental housing projects, a rental property satisfies the requirements if 20% of the units are occupied by individuals or families whose income is 50% or less of area median gross income, and that's by family size, or 40% of the units at 60% of area median income. I would say that all but one of the projects I've worked on in 20 years have gone for the 20% of the residential units at 50% or less of area median income. It was fewer units to have the income restriction, and the restriction wasn't that much lower than the 40% restriction. And so most developers have selected the 20 at 50. These requirements apply for the life of the district. They have to be monitored. The municipality or the county that creates the TIF district has to collect information on a regular basis to make sure that the developer is complying with these income restrictions. And they vary by county. These are county-based income restrictions. And I would say in most counties, it kind of starts for a family of one or two in that high 20s to low $30,000 per year in household income. And then it grows from there by a few $1,000s per family member added. And, if anybody emails me, I can certainly send them the table that provides the different income levels or restrictions for the 20 at 50% income requirement. So how is TIF applied? Generally, the TIF assistance on rental property is used to subsidize the land acquisition and site improvements associated with the development of a rental project. And that assistance can take the form of an upfront contribution, meaning there's cash provided in advance, or land is acquired by the city, which is given to the developer, and the city then reimburses itself through the collection of tax increments. Or a pay-as-you-go benefit. In tax increment financing, common lingo is called pay-as-you-go, because that's the way that most municipalities have learned is the risk-free way of using this tool. And what it means ultimately is we are reimbursing a private developer a portion of their property tax. That's the tax increment we're collecting in the district. And we're doing that for a specified period of time if they meet certain performance standards. They have to meet the income requirements, maybe other issues, pay utility bills on time, things like that. But at the end of the day, the city's only obligation is to reimburse the tax increments that are paid by the developer to the county in the form of their property tax payment that are then distributed from the county back to the city. And a portion of that is then reimbursed to the developer. So if the developer doesn't pay his property tax, there's no tax increment generated and there's no reimbursement provided. If we've provided upfront assistance, if the city has bought land, given it to the developer, and the developer fails to make property tax payments, the city's not able to reimburse itself. And so that's where you see folks taking different levels of risk as they evaluate the benefit of using tax increment financing for housing. If pay-as-you-go is essentially the risk-free way of providing TIF assistance, that upfront contribution has some risk associated with, relying on this future revenue stream and property taxes being paid in a timely manner. So some pictures or examples of rental housing that we've worked that have been incorporated into TIF districts over the years are provided. This one in particular was also funded with tax credits, and there's an important point here. On a number of the programs through the various entities, state, quasi-governmental entities that provide assistance for housing, oftentimes they'll look for a local contribution. And oftentimes that application will allude to that local contribution being provided in the form of tax increment financing. In fact, it's probably still the case with regard to tax credit projects. This is a picture of a tax credit project that on the application itself, it'll ask if the local unit of government is providing TIF assistance, and the applicant that's applying for those tax credits or that subsidy will receive additional points in the process because they have that local government investing in the project. Very common amongst the various programs to look for some form of local assistance when we're applying for grants or other aids, at a state, national, or quasi-governmental level. And TIF is a form of assistance that's generally been accepted by those entities as demonstrating a contribution and support to the local unit of government. So we've talked about TIF quite a bit. Now we're going to switch gears for a few minutes and talk about tax abatement. And we say, we think it should be called tax rebatement because it does not reduce a property's tax liability or payments. Abatement is a tool authorized under statute that provides a mechanism for reimbursing a portion of property tax for a specific purpose. So it gives you the opportunity to rebate property taxes or, like TIF, apply them for other specific purposes. So it wasn't really a new tool. It just got formalized in statute probably a dozen years ago. But cities and counties, EDAs and HRAs used to do this informally. They used to call it local option TIF, where you would just levy your portion of the property tax revenue that a project is ultimately going to be paying. Now, unlike TIF, participation in tax abatement is optional for each of the units of government. Each taxing jurisdiction has to decide whether or not it's going to provide its share of the property tax for the project. This gets really interesting in some instances because we have folks at the county and school district level that have never done economic development projects in some instances. And when that's the case, there's a long process for providing some education on the use of these tools, why they should support housing. We could go on and on about all the benefits of doing that, but ultimately it's a new process for them. And so that's probably the most interesting part of the tax abatement process, is that each entity has to hold a public hearing and make a determination if they're willing to provide their share of the property tax for the project. We need private sector real estate investment that pays property tax in order for this to work. So there has to be a property tax to either capture it in a TIF district or to abate it through the abatement process. So it doesn't work on tax exempt property, just so we understand. So who can do abatement? Cities, counties, townships, schools. I would mention that an important piece that you should understand is with tax increment financing, uh, that when a TIF district is created, that tax base is considered not available tax base to a school district, and therefore they are not they are not punished in their funding formula with the state of Minnesota. When we use tax abatement, and if a school district chooses to participate, that tax base is considered available tax base. And that can mean a reduction in revenue from the state of Minnesota. And so school districts can and should be a little more reluctant to participate on tax abatement. They shouldn't have that excuse to be a part of a tax increment district or to be opposed to a TIF district, because that does not impact their funding formula like tax abatement does. So in tax abatement law, it says we have to find a public purpose. Pretty easy to do. We have to increase or preserve tax base, provide employment opportunities, construct public facilities or infrastructure, redevelop or renew blighted areas, or provide access to services. Just about anything you do meets one of those tests. And so abatement law tends to be very flexible. And what can the term of the abatement be? The maximum term for a cooperative abatement is 15 years. The maximum duration for a housing TIF district that we were just talking about is 26 years. So we have much longer TIF capture than just a regular cooperative abatement. We can extend an abatement to 20 years if one entity, it's typically the school district, chooses to decline in writing. So in many instances, we're contacting the school district and saying, we understand you don't want to participate. Will you send us a letter indicating that? And that's sufficient to be able to extend the duration of a tax abatement to 20 years. Whose property taxes can be abated? Anybody that pays property taxes ultimately. Through the process, you must identify the specific parcels involved. Similarly, in TIF districts, we have to identify the parcels we're putting in the TIF district. So how much can a jurisdiction abate? There's no limit on tax increment financing with regard to how much tax base can be included. But with abatement, most small communities are limited to $200,000 per year, and that's per political subdivision. So a city, for example, a small city, in most instances can abate no more than $200,000 in a calendar year. For larger cities, it's 10% of its net tax capacity, which is a function of its tax base. So counties, that can grow to a rather large number. Large cities, that can be a big number that they can actually abate. But most small communities were at that $200,000 limitation. And for any parcel, any amount the jurisdiction deems appropriate. So you can abate all of the property tax paid on a parcel. So if we have a redevelopment project, unlike TIF, where we're only capturing the new tax associated with the increase in market value, with abatement, you could actually abate all of the existing tax base as well. So it has a little bit more power on those redevelopment projects than TIF might. Again, we're talking about generally new taxes generated by a new specific project, but abatement has that one advantage of the existing taxes if absolutely necessary. And the upper limit, we can't abate any more than the share of property taxes paid by the parcels identified. So we can't artificially inflate that number. So how can we use abatements? We can reimburse developers for private development expenses. We can pay for public infrastructure. The improvements do not have to be adjacent to the abatement parcels, where in TIF districts, the improvements and the area where we're capturing and spending the tax have to be, within the boundaries of that district in most instances. With abatement, we don't have to do that. Ultimately, we have to derive some benefit, or make a link to the benefit associated with the project, but they don't have to be on the same parcel. For example, if we had a local manufacturer that was saying, we need housing, I can't hire anybody because nobody can live in my community. Ultimately, there could be a link made through abatement law that abating the tax on an expansion of that industry for the use to subsidize housing would be appropriate, because that manufacturer has said the key to our growth is having additional affordable housing in our community. So we could ultimately make that link between abating tax on that private business and using those abated dollars or rebated dollars or captured dollars to, financially assist a housing project. Maybe we purchase land or install infrastructure, any of those activities that are commonly undertaken to promote housing. We can also make bond payments just like we can in TIF on costs that are financed with the proceeds of tax abatement bonds. So how do bonds work with abatement authority? There's no referendum required. They don't count towards a statutory debt limit that cities and counties and others have imposed by state statute. So they don't count towards that limit. The principal amount of the bonds has to equal the sum of all the abatements. Interest can actually be covered by other sources, a pledge, tax levy, or some other form of revenue. Once issued, an issuer can levy for payments and need not check to see what the abatements actually are. So we just have to prove that when we originated the bond issue that we had sufficient property taxes to make the principal payments, but we don't have to monitor that over time. And where two jurisdictions, a city and a county, for example, are providing abatements, debt can be sized using both contributions. So we can do one bond issue that relies on abatements collected by both entities. So here's a bit of a comparison. This tends to be a useful slide out of the whole presentation. This may be the only one you would copy off or print off and keep handy. It's a comparison between the two tools. With TIF, we automatically capture most local taxes. I mentioned we're notifying the county and school district that we're creating a TIF district, but we're not asking their permission. Ultimately, it's just created. There's lots of rules and reporting requirements with TIF. There's annual reports filed to the state of Minnesota, and they're no small undertaking. I'll put it that way. With TIF, when we create it, the county inputs this tax increment district into their software, and magically we receive an additional payment with our tax settlement if we're a city. And so we don't have to make a levy. We don't have to monitor anything, much. At the end of the day, it's a process that's mostly handled by the county through the tax collections. We can make long-term commitments with TIF up to 26 years, as I mentioned, for housing projects. With TIF, we have all of that legislation that's been created over, probably about 40 years now, that limits us, in many ways on projects. And ultimately, in order to determine if what you're intending to do is legal, you probably need specialized assistance to work your way through that process. But once you've created the TIF district, the bonding or borrowing against that revenue stream is relatively easy and flexible. And we can have what's called an assessment agreement, meaning if we have a private developer that we're providing cash assistance up front, we can have them sign an assessment agreement that establishes a minimum market value for property tax purposes. And that minimum market value has to be reasonable, but it helps to guarantee the revenue stream for the repayment of that upfront assistance. Tax abatement doesn't have similar authority. Just working down that column, what are the differences in tax abatement? Each jurisdiction speaks for itself. We have to get permission or direct participation actually from the county and the school district. There's not a ton of rules and no annual reporting unless it's a business subsidy for now. Each jurisdiction must calculate, budget, and levy the tax abatement. So here's a noticeable difference. When a city sets its levy, ultimately they're adding the abatement amount to that tax levy. And so when the newspaper reports on what the city is doing for its tax levy, they'll be looking at the total, which includes that abatement levy. And so they'll say the city's tax levy is going up 10%. It can be misleading because if the tax base that we're abating, so we have a large new housing project in a small community and it accounts for the abatement accounts for a 10% levy increase. It's not really impacting the other taxpayers because we're bringing on new tax base in the community. We're adding a new taxpayer to the community at the same time we're implementing this levy, and so they offset each other. What can be misleading is that the city's adding this dollar amount to its levy. The newspaper reports that the levy is going up by X%, but at the end of the day, we haven't negatively impacted other taxpayers from the perspective that we have a new taxpayer in the community that's making a tax payment that's equal to that added abatement levy. And, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of flexibility in abatement law. And ultimately, when all else fails, it's generally the law we're pointing to when we want to provide some form of assistance for a specific project. So we'll get into corporate purpose bonds or essential function bonds ultimately. This is a tool that's used by local governments that want to directly finance housing projects. It provides statutory authority for local units of government to directly finance. There's a $5 million limit, but at the end of the day, it allows you to borrow that amount of money in order to construct public housing. It can be issued as either a general obligation or a revenue bond. The difference in the interest rate between those two different types of bonds is about 1%. I would tell you that revenue bonds for housing projects are probably more difficult to find a home for these days. And when we use that term general obligation, what that means is that the local unit of government that's issuing those bonds is pledging their ability to levy taxes against all taxpayers in the community. So they have this backstop of being able to level for the repayment of those bonds. Those projects that are funded with corporate purpose bonds are eligible to make a payment in lieu of taxes or pilot, which is much lower than a standard property tax payment. It's 5% of the gross shelter rents. But at the end of the day, it's a significant reduction in the annual property tax that's required from this particular project. Income limits are 80% of area median income, or it can be for senior housing without income restrictions. Added a few pictures of some different essential function bond projects that have been constructed over the years. Good quality housing. My favorite story to tell is when I was in the city of Jackson many years ago. The day I started working for the city as an economic development director, I was undertaking the management of construction of new essential function bond housing that the city had borrowed money for to construct. And soon after, accepting the position, I had somebody tell me that, this wasn't a great idea. Why would the city build public housing that's subsidized? We're going to attract an unwanted element to the community. And our first 3 tenants in that project were an engineer at Ag Chem Equipment Company, a teacher in the school district, and a nun from the Catholic Church. And so if that's the element we don't want to attract to the community, we have problems. So at the end of the day, it's providing market rate housing that meets a rental need in the community. And so kind of sum up some recommendations that we have as we've worked our way through these various tools. Ultimately, my recommendation to you folks as you evaluate, what needs to be done in the community and how you want to tackle these housing issues is that you want to work on a variety of housing types. Providing the consumer with choices is critical to development of housing demand. You don't want to overbuild one segment, and you need to carefully analyze the market generally with a housing study, because overbuilding the market in one area, particularly as a public entity or working with a public entity, is a ticket to long-term failure. In South Central Minnesota, we had a project called Amberfield that was constructed, somewhere in the neighborhood of 27 years ago. That was funded through a multi-county HRA, ultimately, that issued debt, and they overbuilt the market. And that project struggled mightily. And, there was lots of politicians, at, county levels in particular that thought they'd done something horribly wrong. and were accused of doing stuff that was horribly wrong. And ultimately what they were guilty of was overbuilding a particular segment of the market for a period of time. That caused most units of government in that part of the state of Minnesota to not use that tool for many, many, many years because it was looked at as an evil proposition, because at one point we had a project that wasn't as successful immediately as it should have been. And so, take that to heart. Don't overbuild one segment of the market. We have to be successful in what we do, particularly if we're using public funding. And success is important because success builds on success. And that's how we get to make a real dent in the housing need that exists in greater Minnesota. Participate in, how do you do that? You participate in those projects that meet the most critical demands first. If you do a housing study, it's going to identify those areas where you have the most need. And if you work on those first, your likelihood of success is much greater. Allow the private sector to an opportunity to meet those unidentified or identified demands. So once we commission a housing study and we have this useful information that says our market needs this type of housing, use that information to try to recruit somebody from the private sector that maybe requires a much smaller subsidy to ultimately accomplish the goal. Remember that the private sector does not always step to the plate. Generally, they're in it for a stated rate of return, and that's become very difficult to achieve in greater Minnesota at this time. There's a pretty wide gap between what we can charge in rental rates in greater Minnesota and what it costs to build these projects. And most of you are probably struggling with that valuation gap and trying to find projects or ways to meet the demand that exists. And it's a tough battle. And then partner with organizations that bring additional resources to the table and have expertise in administration and counseling. Programs like Homestretch have been very successful in counseling first-time home buyers that are buying new construction, helping them not get in over their heads on particular projects we've worked with. Even during the mass foreclosures that occurred in 2008, most of the projects that were publicly subsidized had low or no foreclosure rates because the folks that purchased those homes were buying reasonable mortgage projects and they had counseling before they bought those homes. And so, all of these things, need to come together when we start looking particularly at public financing, because as I mentioned, when we do these things, we need to be successful. And so at the end of the day, that's the advice I have to offer. And with that, I'm ready to have some questions fired at me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Feel free to unmute your mic and ask your questions of Shannon.
And Shannon, I'll kick us off. We had a question asked in the chat if you could speak to TIF being used for rehabilitation expenses for existing properties.
Absolutely. Just worked on a project, a common bond project in LeSueur, Minnesota, that had two separate projects within a project. One was the rehabilitation of existing units and the other was construction of new units. And so it is used commonly for both. In some instances, it may be a different type of TIF district that's created, not a housing district, but rather a redevelopment TIF district. Those have a similar duration of up to 26 years. And if it is eligible for a redevelopment TIF district, there are no income restrictions that would be applied to the project.
Shannon, in your experience, what was the smallest community size that utilized TIF on a project?
Boy, it would probably be in that 800 or 900 population. I can think of one community that's worked on some owner occupied housing in a community that size. For rental, probably closer to 1,500 to 2,000 population.
Great, thanks.
Aaron, I know you had a question. We could throw it to you if you'd like to ask the question you posted.
No, that's all right. You can just read it.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Shannon, how might you speak to how would a senior cooperative with limited support services be classified in a TIF project, specifically a project that catered to residents 55 plus, multifamily unit?
Sure. Similar restrictions apply. It's, based on that area median income by family size. It could be within a housing district. Again, we would just have to have 20% of the units that meet the income requirements, which at the senior level is generally very easy to accommodate. Folks may have lots of assets, but their income usually, we can find those 20% that meet the income restrictions required.
Could a local government create an entity to and essentially fund it with some type of bond to underwrite starting a project like that?
If it were a cooperative, they probably not. At the end of the day, the governmental means of finance are directed more towards rental housing, with the exception of the investments they make in public infrastructure to serve owner-occupied housing. So when you ask, could it be done? I probably could do it with a tax abatement bond. It would use most of the city's capacity, and ultimately, there'd be some issues that we'd have to work through in order to make that happen.
I'm just concerned with the recent publications and the study last year on senior housing that talked about senior housing being out of reach of something like more than 50% of middle income owners within less than 10 years. And so starting to think of that rolling at us in rural Minnesota, it's a really big deal. And so, anything we can do to beef up housing right now, senior housing, is really going to be to a credit and hopefully the benefit of our residents.
Yeah. I have a client community, city of Sherburne. I believe the city of Eota down in southeast Minnesota have both constructed senior housing facilities that they issued bonds to fund. And they were the housing bonds that we were talking about, or the essential function bonds. Ultimately they had an unmet need in their community, and they did issue that type of financing. They've expanded, at least in Sherburne, that project is expanded a couple of times now. It's been successful, but ultimately there's probably still going to be an affordability gap based on the cost of services that are provided in some of those facilities.
How long have those projects been going on? I mean, are there people you can connect to?
Sherburne's probably been around for at least, I would say 15 years at least, and Eota probably a similar timeline. I would say the challenging part for both of those communities, I and a coworker served both of those communities, and in the early years, with that form of senior housing, the biggest challenge is the lease up period. And both of those communities had to feed those projects during that lease up period, which in a small community is a huge undertaking. When you're providing housing with services, you have a big labor bill, I'll put it that way. And you still have that labor bill, even if you have 2 tenants or 10 tenants. It does scale a little bit, but at the end of the day, there's employees that need to be paid. And so it's that scale up period that caused a lot of stress on the local government, for both of those projects. And so it's not something to be taken on lightly, and understand that the most difficult period is probably the first 4 years of the life of that project.
Well, and that's, I guess, where I was trying to think creatively with the tax increment financing and only the first, essentially, if you consider cooperative owner occupied only the first needs to qualify. And by creating an entity that would fund the project with bonds, then those people are bought out as things go to market rate and move forward.
Yeah, I don't think we have direct authority under the corporate purpose bonds to do owner occupied housing. And so we probably can't with those bonds. But again, with tax abatement bonds, there's probably some possibility. I would rather see a private developer do it and use a tax abatement bond, for example, to entice them to do it and fund a portion of the project cost to keep it more affordable, rather than having the unit of government take it all on. And, in that way it would be taxable. If a unit of government owned it, generally they're not going to pay a property tax. And so, we're limited in our use of abatement and TIF.
I guess where I was going is that especially in these much smaller communities, getting any developer interested in this type of housing and taking that chance is very difficult.
Yeah, I would say difficult, but it's been done. If you throw some of these tools at them, ultimately there's a point at which it will start to make sense and they'll become engaged. There has to be a market first and foremost, though.
Thank you.
We have another question posted in the chat. I'll throw out there. Can TIF funds be used for the construction of the housing, or just the expenses that you listed on that slide that you presented?
It depends on which bond attorney you ask. That's all I got to say about that. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble.
Any other questions for Shannon?
I have kind of a different question. Can TIF be used to develop sites for housing to kind of make it site ready so that a developer could come in and maybe build some duplexes or something like that? Or housing
Yes.
needs built?
Yes. And, we'll, an example project, I think you've even may have met with the city of St. Peter, for example. They issued TIF bonds to fund infrastructure, meaning streets, water, sanitary sewer, to serve a subdivision. That subdivision had spots for both multifamily housing and single family housing. So they create one TIF district, they build a subdivision through the issuance of TIF bonds to fund it. And ultimately they need stuff to get constructed to generate the increment to pay those bonds back. That takes a city of a certain size to be able to afford and take the risk on a project depending on the scope of the project. But at the end of the day, you are taking the risk and serving as a developer. And sometimes you can sit on those projects for quite a while and you have to ultimately make the debt service payments in the meantime. But it is done. It's done with some frequency by communities in greater Minnesota of that size. It's done on a smaller scale by communities that are, smaller than St. Peter, but it basically you have to scale it to your tolerance for risk.
David, I've got, you've been very generous with your time. And I assume your firm is saying, good for you for doing this good pro bono lecture for us. So I'm unfamiliar with your firm. If you could tell us a little bit about David Drown, that would be useful.
Sure. David Drown started this company in 1997. I started working for him in 2000, end of 2000. So just finished my 20th year in working for him. We're, our title, or we're licensed as municipal advisors under SEC rules. And so what we do is generally we're assisting cities in borrowing money for projects through the issuance of bonds and the use of tax increment financing, tax abatement, and other subsidies. Our firm has we're located mostly in greater Minnesota, and I would say probably 95% of the work we do is in greater Minnesota. Most of the staff have roots in greater Minnesota working in local government, and that's where we've expanded the company. And so we're used to working in small communities that are challenging. I think I have the record of serving the smallest community of Manchester, which was about 78 people. I'm proud of that. So, but occasionally we serve larger units of government like City of Shorewood or things like that as well, or counties. But vast majority of the work we do is in outstate Minnesota. And tonight I'm going to 2 council meetings in Redwood Falls and the city of Echo. So Echo is probably 200 population, and we help them address issues. So that's what we do.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Shannon, for sharing your expertise with us today. I'm sure many of the participants will find this useful, and let's everybody give them a big round of applause.
Well, thanks.
Mic'd or not.
Thank you. Yeah, right. Is that when I get to turn my camera on? Thank you very much. That was really helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you.
MHP will also upload additional guidance to the Shannon's PowerPoint presentation will also be, you can find that under module 3 on the Moodle platform, along with his contact information. Thank you everyone for participating. And if you'd like to hang around afterwards, we'd be more than happy to walk you through Moodle. Please remember to fill out the survey. Harlan, do you want to post that in the chat box one more time?
Absolutely.
And then one last thing, I'd like to remind you of your homework for the April 20th workshop. Each team will provide a brief update on your selected project or program by sharing your team's accomplishments, challenges, and goals over the past 3 months. I want to encourage everyone to continue sharing information with the group at large through the blogging feature on Moodle. We have some suggested activities for the blog in module 3. But feel free to post anything that you'd like to share, change, and where we can learn from each other and ask questions and get to know other communities that are struggling with similar housing issues. And again, if you want a special tutoring session with Harlan on how to access Moodle or how to use the blog feature, just give him a call or send him an email. He would be more than happy to provide some assistance. So it was wonderful to see you all here again. And I hope that you will join us on April 20th at 2 p.m. And we're going to start covering housing development topics in the next kickoff. We'll have our very own Leah Hall, who is on the Owatonna team, and she will be presenting at our next, on the April 20th session. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you.